They laughed when the single dad walked into that garage every morning smelling like motor oil and cheap coffee. They laughed when the billionaire's convoy pulled up to his crumbling shop and a woman in $1,000 coat stepped out like she owned the whole street. Because she probably could. They stopped laughing when Mason Calloway looked at a car that had defeated 300 elite engineers, crossed his arms, and said quietly, "It's not broken. Someone made sure it stayed that way." What he found inside that machine would shake an entire industry to its foundation. Stay with me until the end. Hit like, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and don't go anywhere. The garage had no sign anymore. The bracket was still bolted above the roll-up door, two rusted L-shaped pieces of metal that used to hold letters. But the letters themselves had come down one winter maybe 4 years ago, and Mason had told himself he'd replace them when things got less tight. Things never got less tight. Now the bracket just hung there, catching pigeons in the morning and casting a thin shadow across the cracked concrete apron where he parked the parts he couldn't fit inside. The town of Harlan Falls, Ohio, wasn't dying so much as it was quietly accepting the situation. The textile plant that anchored the east side had closed in 2019, and the 2 blocks of storefronts on Meridian Street were running about 40% occupied. People weren't leaving in droves, they were just not coming back once they left for college or work. And the ones who stayed were making do in the particular way that people make do when they don't have a lot of options, carefully, without complaint, and with a certain edge of pride that outsiders sometimes mistook for stubbornness. Mason Calloway had grown up here. He'd left once for almost 8 years and come back carrying fewer things than he'd taken with him. No wife anymore. A daughter. A specific kind of quiet that settled on a man after enough had happened to him. He was 35, though people who didn't know him sometimes guessed older because he had the kind of face that had been outdoors a lot and hadn't always remembered sunscreen. He was broad through the shoulders, not from a gym, but from actual work. Pulling engines, pressing floor jacks, hauling transmissions across concrete. His hands were permanently stained along the knuckle lines in a way that soap couldn't fully fix, and he'd stopped being self-conscious about that sometime around age 28. The garage was called Calloway Auto Restoration, technically, if you looked at the paperwork. In practice, people just said Mason's place, or they described it by its location, down by the old rail spur, past the feed co-op, because Harlan Falls was small enough that directions still worked that way. He did good work. That was the one thing nobody in town argued about, even the people who privately thought Mason Calloway was too proud for his own financial good. He turned down jobs he didn't think he could do right. He quoted fairly and stuck to the quote. He'd once spent 11 weeks on a 1968 Mustang that a retired schoolteacher had inherited from her brother, sourcing original parts from 4 different states, and he'd charged her exactly what he'd estimated at the start, which was considerably less than the job actually cost him in time. The schoolteacher had cried a little when she saw the finished car. Mason had been embarrassed by that and found reasons to be in the back of the shop until she drove away. His daughter's name was Lily. She was 8 years old, small for her age, with her mother's eyes and Mason's stubbornness, and a very specific opinion about which cartoons were worth watching and which were not. She went to Harlan Falls Elementary on weekdays, and on afternoons when school let out early or the babysitting arrangement fell through, she sat in the office corner of the garage on a stool she'd claimed as hers, doing homework or drawing or narrating what Mason was doing in a running commentary that he had mostly tuned out, but would have immediately noticed if it stopped. "You put that piece in wrong," she said one Thursday afternoon in early October, not looking up from her worksheet. "I didn't put it in wrong." "You made the face you make when you put something in wrong." Mason looked at the carburetor he was holding. He checked it. He turned it 90 degrees and it seated correctly with a click that hadn't been there before. Lily still didn't look up. "Told you." "Thank you, he said, which was the answer she expected and also happened to be true. That was their Thursday. Mason working, Lily doing math she didn't need help with, the radio in the corner running through a classic country station that neither of them particularly loved, but both had stopped noticing, the space heater ticking on the far wall, the smell of motor oil and metal, and the faint chemical sweetness of the parts cleaner he used on Thursdays. The convoy arrived at 4:17 in the afternoon. Mason heard it before he saw it, the low, expensive hum of engines that had never had to work hard, The crunch of tires on his gravel lot that sounded somehow more deliberate than ordinary tires. He came around from behind the '72 Chevelle he'd been working on and stood in the open roll-up door and watched 3 black SUVs pull in, and then a flatbed truck behind them carrying something covered in a fitted gray tarp. The SUVs parked. Men got out. 4 of them, 2 from the first vehicle, 1 each from the others, all wearing the specific kind of casual clothing that cost more than it looked like it cost. None of them were looking at Mason. They were looking outward, at the street, at the co-op across the way, at the roof lines. It was a particular kind of looking that Mason recognized from a previous chapter of his life and didn't especially enjoy being reminded of. Then the rear door of the middle SUV opened, and a woman stepped out. She was younger than he expected, maybe 30, give or take a year, with the kind of composure that you either had or you didn't and couldn't fully fake. She wore a camel-colored coat that was obviously expensive and also obviously chosen to look less expensive than it was, which told Mason something about how she moved through the world. Dark hair pulled back, no visible jewelry except small earrings. She looked at the garage front and then at the missing sign bracket, and then at Mason in the doorway, and she walked toward him directly, without checking to see if her people were following. "Mason Calloway?" she said. "That's on the paperwork, yeah." She didn't smile, but something in her expression shifted in a way that suggested she'd filed the answer somewhere. She put out her hand. "Evelyn Sterling." He shook it. Her grip was firm and brief, no performance to it. "I know who you are," he said, because he did. You didn't have to follow the automotive industry closely to know the name Evelyn Sterling. She'd taken over Sterling Motors at 26 when her father died, and in 4 years she'd turned it from a boutique manufacturer with a reputation for beautiful cars and questionable finances into one of the most talked-about companies in the clean energy vehicle space. Business magazines ran her picture about twice a year. He'd seen it at the dentist's office. "Good," she said. "Then I can skip some of the introduction." She turned and nodded toward the flatbed. "I need you to look at something." "I'm working." "I know. I'll pay for your time regardless of whether you take the job." Mason looked past her at the flatbed, at the shape under the tarp. Whatever it was, it sat low and long and had the silhouette of something that had been designed with more than function in mind. He looked back at Evelyn Sterling, who was watching him with the patient attention of someone who was used to being waited on but had the intelligence to not make it obvious. "My daughter's in the office," he said. "Okay." "I'm not moving the car until she leaves for the night." Something crossed Evelyn's face that might have been surprise and might have been something else. "We can wait," she said. They waited. Mason's neighbor, Carol Briggs, came by at 5:30 to pick up Lily, as she did on Thursdays, and Lily appeared in the garage doorway with her backpack and her lunchbox, and looked at the black SUVs and the men and Evelyn Sterling with the frank, unimpressed evaluation of an 8-year-old who had seen her father work on expensive machines for people with expensive tastes and had concluded that expensive did not automatically mean interesting. "Is that the lady from the magazine, sis?" she asked Mason, not quietly. "We're talking about it." Lily looked at Evelyn Sterling. "I like your coat," she said, and then went to find Carol's car. After she was gone, Mason pulled the tarp. The car underneath was unlike anything he'd seen in person, though he recognized the design language immediately. It had the organic flow of European prototypes from the late 90s, the kind of shape that auto designers produced when they were allowed to prioritize beauty over manufacturing practicality. 2 seats. Long hood. The body panels were made of something he couldn't immediately identify, not aluminum, not standard steel, with a surface texture that caught the fading afternoon light differently depending on the angle. He walked around it without touching it for a full 2 minutes. "How old?" he said. "We believe it was constructed between 1998 and 2001, Evelyn said. She'd come to stand near the front of the car. "We're not entirely certain because the build documentation is incomplete." "Where'd you get it?" A brief pause. "It was my father's. We found it in a storage facility in Pennsylvania 6 months ago. It had been there for over 20 years. Mason crouched and looked at the undercarriage. Someone had done work down there, but not recently. The modifications he could see had the particular oxidation pattern of old work on old metal, not restoration, original construction. He stood up. "Why me?" he said. "You've got an engineering division. You've got people." 312 engineers have examined this vehicle in the past 4 months, Evelyn said. Between Sterling Motors' internal team, 3 independent consultancies, and 2 university engineering departments, none of them have been able to determine why it won't run. Mason looked at her. None of them. It starts. It idles. The moment you put it under any load at all, it dies. Instantly, with no diagnostic codes. No engineering team has been able to explain it. And you drove to Harlan Falls, Ohio. I drove to Harlan Falls because a man named Raymond Oakes at the Kenosha Museum of Transportation told me that the only mechanic who'd ever correctly identified a problem with his 1939 Delahaye, a problem that 2 restoration specialists in Europe had missed, was a guy named Calloway running a shop in central Ohio. And because, she said, with a directness that he appreciated more than he expected to, I'm running out of people to try. Mason looked at the car again. He put his hand on the hood, just resting it there, not pressing. The metal was faintly warm from the October sun, or from something internal. He wasn't sure which. $1 million, Evelyn said, to find and fix the problem. I'll have a contract drawn up tonight. Mason didn't say anything for a moment. He was looking at the seam along the hood where it met the front quarter panel. There was something slightly off about it, not a damaged seam, a manufactured one. The gap spacing was deliberately inconsistent in a way that wasn't an accident and wasn't a flaw. I'm not taking your $1 million, he said. The shift in the room was immediate. He felt it in the way the 2 men nearest to him moved, slightly. Not toward him, but in the way men move when something surprises them, and they haven't decided yet what it means. Evelyn's expression didn't change. Can I ask why? Mason straightened up and looked at her. Because the car isn't broken, he said. Whoever built this made it look broken. That seam there, he pointed at the hood line. That's not a manufacturing variance. That's intentional. There's something inside this car that someone wanted to stay hidden, and if I take your $1 million and fix it, I become liable for whatever comes out of it. He paused. You need a lawyer more than you need a mechanic. Evelyn Sterling looked at the seam he'd pointed to. She looked at it for a long time. When she looked back at Mason, something had changed in her face. Not cracked exactly, but shifted, like a door had opened a few inches behind her eyes. What do you think is in there? She said. Her voice was careful, but not controlled enough to hide the fact that she wasn't entirely surprised. I don't know yet, Mason said, but it's not a mechanical fault. The lot was quiet. October wind moved across the gravel and rattled the parts he had stacked against the outside wall. I'm not asking you to fix it immediately, she said. I'm asking you to look at it, to tell me what you see. Whatever your hourly rate is, my hourly rate is $80. Fine. I'll pay whatever you bill. No contract if that makes you more comfortable. Just look at it and tell me what you think. Mason considered her for a moment. He considered the car. He thought about Lily at Carol's house, probably complaining about the car ride because Carol listened to talk radio, and Lily found talk radio philosophically offensive. You can leave it here, he said, but it stays under tarp until I'm ready to start, and I start on my schedule, not yours. Understood. And I need the name of the engineer who built it, whatever documentation you actually have, not the official paperwork, the real records. There it was again, that fractional pause before she answered. I'll see what I can provide. That means you have more than you've said. Evelyn Sterling looked at him steadily. It means I'll see what I can provide, she said again, and the repetition was its own kind of answer. The SUVs left, the flatbed left. The car sat in Mason's garage under its gray tarp, and Mason locked up and drove to Carol's to get Lily, and they ate dinner, pasta, because Lily had lobbied for pasta and Mason had not had a strong counterargument, and he helped with the last of her homework and got her to bed by 8:45. He sat at the kitchen table afterward with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while he was reading Lily her chapter. He thought about the seam on the hood. He thought about the way Evelyn Sterling's voice had shifted, that very small, very precise shift, when he'd said the car had been made to look broken. He thought about the kind of person who would hide something inside a prototype automobile and then arrange for it to disappear into a storage facility for 20 years. He thought about what kind of thing would be worth that kind of effort. The coffee sat untouched in front of him. Outside, the October wind was moving through the maple at the end of the driveway, and the street was the particular quiet of a small town at 9 at night, which was a quiet Mason had come to know well enough to stop fighting. He didn't sleep much that night. He started on the car the following Monday, not because he'd decided to take the job in any formal sense. There was no contract, no handshake beyond the one in the parking lot, no agreement that extended past Evelyn Sterling's word that she would pay his rate. He started because he hadn't been able to stop thinking about that seam. And in Mason's experience, when a car wouldn't leave his head, it was because the car had something to say and he hadn't listened closely enough yet. He moved it inside on Sunday night, after Lily was at Carol's for a sleepover. He pulled the tarp himself, folded it, set it on the parts shelf. Then he turned on every light in the garage and just stood there with a cup of coffee and looked at the thing for 40 minutes without picking up a single tool. The car was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when no one was trying to make them beautiful. When the shape came from the engineer's internal logic and the aesthetics were almost a byproduct. The lines ran low and continuous from the nose to the tail without interruption. The surface, whatever material it was, had a quality in artificial light that it hadn't shown in afternoon sun. It seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, which shouldn't have been possible with any automotive finish he knew, and probably meant it wasn't a standard finish. He photographed every panel before he touched anything. Exterior first, then he photographed the engine compartment when he lifted the hood, then the undercarriage from 4 angles with his phone on a creeper. He had a particular system for documentation that he'd developed over the years, not from any formal training, but from the expensive lesson of once disassembling a carburetor on a 1966 GTO and forgetting which way one of the secondary throttle plates was oriented. The GTO job had added 6 hours and a fair amount of quiet swearing to his timeline. He hadn't made that mistake twice. The engine was the first thing that didn't match. From the outside, the car's proportions suggested a mid-size power plant, maybe a V6 or a compact V8. What sat in the engine bay was neither. It was smaller than it should have been given the space allocated for it, and it was built around a central core that he didn't immediately recognize. The ancillary systems, cooling, fuel delivery, what appeared to be an electrical management array, were arranged around that core in a way that was both intensely logical and completely unlike any architecture he'd worked on. The components were connected, but there was a quality to the layout that suggested the connections were secondary, like the systems had been designed to support the core, not the other way around. He didn't touch the engine on Monday. He photographed it from a dozen angles and made notes in the small yellow legal pad he kept on the workbench, and then he spent 3 hours on the body panels, specifically on the hood seam he'd identified in the lot Friday afternoon. Up close, with proper light, it was even more clearly deliberate. The gap varied by almost 3 millimeters over a 14-inch run, which in manufacturing terms was an enormous variance. Production lines held tolerances tighter than that on economy cars, let alone a hand-built prototype. But the inconsistency wasn't random. It had a pattern, wide at the midpoint, narrowing at each end, which was the signature of something that was meant to be opened, not from the front like a normal hood, but from the center outward. He found the release mechanism on Tuesday morning. It wasn't a lever or a latch in any conventional sense. It was a section of the structural framing below the hood surface, a 3-inch segment of what looked like ornamental bracing that, when pressed at a specific point and rotated 30 degrees clockwise, disengaged a secondary locking mechanism that the normal hood release didn't affect. He found it by feel, running his fingers along the underside of the hood with the engine bay light on, pressing and testing every structural element until something moved that shouldn't have. When the hidden section of the hood lifted, he sat back on his heels and stayed very still for a moment. The compartment was roughly the size of a large shoebox. It was built into the firewall side of the engine bay, behind the main cooling system, in a space that shouldn't have had room for anything but insulation. It was lined with a thin aluminum sheeting that had tarnished to a dull gray, and inside it, sealed in a flat plastic sleeve that had once been vacuum sealed but had lost its seal at some point in the past 2 decades, were documents. Mason did not touch them. He stood up, stepped back from the car, and looked at the garage door. Locked. Looked at the side door. Locked. He'd locked up when he started work, which was habit, not because he'd expected anything like this. He took his phone out of his pocket and called the number Evelyn Sterling had given him. She picked up on the second ring, which told him she'd been waiting for him to call, which told him she knew more than she'd said in the parking lot, which he'd already suspected. "You need to come to the garage," he said. A pause. "You found something." "I found something. I need you here before I touch it." Another pause, different quality. "I'll be there in 3 hours." "I'll be here?" She was there in 2.5. She came alone this time. No convoy, no men looking at roof lines. She knocked on the side door because the roll-up was down. And when he let her in, she looked at the car, and then at the open compartment, and then at him, and whatever she was feeling, she'd put most of it somewhere he couldn't see. "What is it?" she said. "Documents. I haven't opened them." He gestured at the compartment. "I wanted you here first." She looked at him for a moment. "Why?" "Because whatever's in there is yours, not mine, and because I wanted a witness to the fact that I didn't open them." Evelyn Sterling looked at the compartment for a long moment and then pulled on the latex gloves he offered her. He kept a box on the bench for work that required clean hands and carefully lifted the plastic sleeve out. The documents inside were blueprints, technical drawings on paper that had aged to a cream yellow, dense with notation in a handwriting that was small and precise, and Mason noticed had the particular compactness of someone who wrote fast and had a lot to say. Evelyn's hands went still. She was holding the top sheet at its edges, tilting it toward the shop light, and Mason watched her face do something complicated and not entirely controlled. Her jaw tightened. She looked at the handwriting in the corner of the page and then looked away from it, at the ceiling, briefly, before looking back. "That's his," she said. It wasn't a question. "Your father." "Yes?" The word came out flat and dry, compressed. "These are—" She stopped. Started again. "These are the original engineering specifications for the core system, the energy conversion unit." She set the first sheet carefully on the clean section of bench Mason had cleared and looked at the second sheet and the third. "He spent 15 years on this," she said. To no one in particular, to the air in the shop. He told people it was theoretical, that he was still in development, but these— She touched the edge of a page with one gloved finger. "These are finished specifications. This is a complete design." Mason let the silence stand. He was good at silence. "The patents that were filed," she said slowly, working through something out loud, "after he died, the ones that became the foundation for 6 major energy systems currently in production, they went to 3 different companies within 18 months of his death." She looked at Mason. "I always thought it was a coincidence of timing, that other engineers had been working on similar problems and filed before we could reorganize the company. I hired lawyers. They said the patents were clean. But these blueprints are dated." "Yes." She looked at the dates in the corners. "By at least 6 years." Mason leaned against the workbench. "So someone knew what he was building, knew the design was complete, and either took these before he died or he hid them," Evelyn said, "in the car, because he knew someone was going to take them." The shop light hummed. Outside on the street, someone drove past slowly. Probably the Hendersons from 2 blocks over. They drove like that. And Mason tracked the sound out of old habit until it faded. "You knew something was in the car," he said, "when you brought it here. You didn't know what, but you suspected." Evelyn set the blueprints down and pulled off the gloves. "I found a letter in his personal files last year. It was addressed to me. He wrote it when I was in college, which means he wrote it about 5 years before he died." She paused. "He said that if anything ever happened to him, I should find a way to get the prototype running, that the car would tell me what he couldn't say while he was alive." She folded the gloves in her hands. "I thought he was being dramatic. My father was— He had a theatrical streak. I didn't look for the car until after the third engineer told me the patent timing was unusual." Mason looked at the blueprints on his bench, at the handwriting that was small and precise and had been hidden in a firewall compartment for over 2 decades. "These companies," he said, The ones holding the patents. Yes, they know about the car. Evelyn looked at him steadily. I think they've known about it since I started looking for it. I think that's why. She stopped. Why what? She took a breath. The storage facility where I found it. The locks had been changed. Not by the facility management. I checked. Someone had replaced the padlocks within the 6 months before I located the unit. They came in, and they left, and they didn't take the car, which means they either couldn't find the compartment, or they found it and it was already empty. Or they left the car because taking it would have confirmed your suspicion. Yes. A pause. And now you found it. Mason straightened up. He looked at the car, at the open section of hood, at the documents on his bench. He thought about the $1 million offer that he'd refused in the parking lot and about why he'd refused it, and he thought the refusal was looking smarter by the minute. You should get those to someone you trust, he said. Not a corporate lawyer, someone outside your industry. I know. Tonight, don't leave them here. I wasn't going to. She was already picking them up carefully, returning them to the plastic sleeve. Mason! She used his name like she'd earned the right to it, which maybe she had, over the past few days. The car, the engine. You said it wasn't broken. It's not. Can you run it? He thought about the central core, the architecture that had nothing to do with anything he'd ever worked on. I need time, he said, and I need you to not tell anyone where the car is. She looked at him. The people who change those locks have resources. I know. They're not going to say, I know, he said again, but I've got a garage on a street where everybody knows everybody else's car. That's worth something. He paused. And I need to understand what I'm working on before anything else moves. If I start that engine without understanding the system, I might damage something that can't be replaced. Evelyn looked at the engine bay, at the compartment that was now empty. How long? However long it takes to do it right. That wasn't an answer she was used to getting, he could tell. She processed it for a moment and then nodded, once, in the way that people nod when they've accepted something they can't change. I'll be nearby, she said. How nearby? Another of those pauses. I rented a house in Millfield. It's 20 minutes from here. Millfield was the next town east. How long have you been renting it? Since last week. Mason looked at her for a moment. She looked back without apology because she wasn't the kind of person who apologized for being strategic, and he respected that more than if she'd tried to explain it away. All right, he said. She left with the blueprints. Mason locked up and went home and lay awake for a while, thinking about the core unit in the engine bay and about the dates on the blueprints and about the specific quality of patience required to hide something inside a machine and trust that the right person would eventually find it. He thought about Evelyn Sterling reading the letter from her father, about her calling the storage facility and discovering the replaced locks, about her sending 300 engineers at a car she suspected held something important and waiting for someone to notice what 300 engineers hadn't noticed. He thought, she's been carrying this for a long time. He didn't sleep well, but he slept. The first note appeared Wednesday morning. It was tucked under the wiper blade of his truck, which was parked in the driveway, which meant it had been put there overnight, which meant someone had walked up his driveway at some point between when he'd gone to bed and when he'd come out at 6:15. The note was a piece of white printer paper folded in thirds, no envelope. He opened it, standing in the driveway in the cold morning, the front door of the house still open behind him. It said, "Some things are worth more buried. Think about your kid." Mason stood there for a moment. The street was quiet and ordinary. The Pemberton kid cycling to school on the far sidewalk. Karen Delacroix pulling her trash bin to the curb 3 houses down. Ordinary Tuesday morning in Harlan Falls, Ohio, except for the note in his hand. He thought about Lily sleeping in her room upstairs, because she had a late start this Wednesday, and he'd let her sleep an extra hour. He thought about the footprints on the frost-touched grass of his driveway that were not his. He went inside. He did not call the police, not yet, because the note had no explicit threat, and because a call to the police would become a thing that Harlan Falls knew about by afternoon. He called Evelyn instead. She arrived in 40 minutes in a plain gray sedan he hadn't seen before. She read the note without touching it. He'd set it on the kitchen table. And something in her face went hard in a particular way, not angry, more like something settling into a new shape. "This is faster than I expected," she said. "You expected it." "I expected something." Once the car started moving, she set the note back down. "The companies that hold the patents, there are three of them: Vantec Industrial, Crown Energy Systems, and a holding group called the Merid Group, which owns portions of both of the others. Combined market capitalization is somewhere above $60 billion. The patents they hold underpin about a third of that valuation." She looked at Mason. "If a set of pre-existing blueprints surfaces that invalidates their IP position, that's not a lawsuit. That's an existential event." "So they're going to come at the car," Mason said. "They're going to come at everything. The car. The blueprints. You." She paused. "Me. But I've been dealing with their lawyers for 2 years. That part I know how to handle." "I'm not a lawyer." "No." She looked at the note again. "Is your daughter safe?" It was a direct question. He appreciated the directness, even though the question itself made something cold move through his chest. "She's safe this morning," he said. "I need to think about the rest of the week." "She could—" Evelyn started. "She goes to her school, she eats her lunch, she does her homework." He said it without heat, but with a finality that landed the way he intended it to. "Nobody's changing my daughter's life because some corporation is afraid of a piece of paper. I'll handle the security side." Evelyn looked at him. She had the look of someone who wanted to argue and had calculated that arguing would not work. "Okay," she said, "but the garage needs to be secure. Nobody gets in here who I don't know." "I'll have someone here this afternoon." "Someone quiet. Not a convoy." "One person. I know someone who's good at not being obvious." Mason nodded. He looked at the note on the kitchen table. He thought about the engine in the garage and the blueprints that were wherever Evelyn had taken them the night before. He thought about the mechanic who'd built something revolutionary and hidden the evidence of it inside his most beloved machine because he'd understood that the world he was moving through wasn't safe for it. He thought that man must have been both brilliant and quietly terrified. "The blueprints," he said. "Where are they?" "With a retired federal patent attorney in Columbus. She's a friend, not a professional contact. No connection to Sterling Motors." She paused. "She's already read the first 3 sheets." "And?" "She called me at midnight," Evelyn said. "She said," and I'm quoting her directly, "Evelyn, what exactly are you standing in the middle of?" Mason was quiet for a moment. "What'd you tell her?" "I said I wasn't sure yet." She looked at him, which was honest. Something shifted in the kitchen then. Some small atmospheric thing that Mason couldn't entirely name. He'd been treating this as a mechanical problem with legal complications. Watching Evelyn Sterling sit at his kitchen table at 7 in the morning with a cold note in front of her and a calculation running behind her eyes, he understood it was something more personal than that for her, and had been for a long time, and she'd been managing it largely alone. "I'll have the engine architecture mapped by end of week," he said. "Once I know the full system, I can tell you what we're dealing with." She looked up. "We?" He thought about that for a second. "Turns out the car is more interesting than I expected," he said. It wasn't a declaration of anything, it was just true. Evelyn Sterling, who had walked into a driveway in Ohio and into a conversation with a mechanic who'd told her no and apparently meant something different by it than she'd expected, looked at Mason Calloway in the flat October morning light coming through his kitchen window, and she didn't smile, but her face did something that was adjacent to relief. "Don't touch the core housing yet," she said. "There are some notes in the documentation I need to send you first." "I wasn't going to touch it yet." "I know. I'm just—" She stopped. "Habit," she said. "I manage things." "I noticed." She picked up her keys from the table and stood. "The person I'm sending will arrive this afternoon. His name is Garrett. He doesn't talk much." "That's fine." "He's good." I assumed. She went to the door and stopped with her hand on it and turned back, and there was something in the turn that was less composed than everything else she'd shown him so far. Some fraction of the weight she'd been carrying visible for just a second before she put it back where it lived. "My father," she said, "used to say that the most dangerous thing about doing something right was that it attracted the attention of people doing it wrong. She paused. I used to think that was just something he said. And now? And now I'm standing in your kitchen at 7 in the morning because someone left a threat under your wiper blade. She opened the door. I'll be in touch. She left. Mason stood in the kitchen for a moment, listening to the house. Upstairs, Lily moved in her room. The particular creak of her floorboard that meant she was up and probably looking for her socks, which were always in the last place she checked. He put the kettle on for her cocoa and thought about the engine core in the locked garage 40 feet from his back door, and about the note on the table, and about the way Evelyn Sterling had said my father, with all that history packed into 2 words. He heard Lily coming down the stairs, one hand on the rail because he'd told her 100 times about running on stairs. And she appeared in the kitchen doorway with her hair half done and one sock on and one sock in her hand. And she looked at the kettle and then at her father's face with the particular attention she sometimes paid him when she'd decided something was worth noticing. You okay? She said. Yeah, he said. You want cocoa? She considered him for a moment longer. 8 years old, and she already had the thing her mother had had. The ability to look at Mason Calloway and suspect the answer was more complicated than the answer he'd given. Okay, she said, and came to sit at the table. And Mason made the cocoa and did not look at the note. And the morning moved on the way mornings did, regular and specific and ordinary on the surface. And he let it. In the garage, under the shop lights that were off, the prototype sat in the dark and waited, the way it had been waiting for 20 years, for someone patient enough to understand what it was actually saying. Garrett arrived that afternoon in a 10-year-old Chevy pickup that had a dent in the front quarter panel and a faded landscaping company logo on the door that looked like it had been there long enough to be legitimate. He was maybe 45, medium height, the kind of build that didn't announce itself, with a face that was specifically forgettable in the way that certain faces are specifically forgettable because someone has worked to make them that way. He shook Mason's hand in the driveway, said his name once, and spent the next 20 minutes walking the perimeter of the property without being asked. When he came back, he said, "Side gate needs a better lock. Motion light on the north corner of the garage is pointed wrong. Covers the wall, not the approach." "I've been meaning to fix the light," Mason said. "I'll fix it this afternoon." "You need tools?" Garrett looked at him with the mild patience of someone who did not need to be asked that question. "No," he said. That was largely the extent of their conversational relationship, which suited Mason fine. Garrett set himself up in the old truck most nights, parked at an angle in the driveway that covered both the garage side door and the street approach. And during the days he did things around the property that looked like maintenance work, because Harlan Falls was the kind of place where a man doing maintenance work was invisible. And Mason worked on the car, and neither of them talked much beyond what the situation required. The documentation Evelyn sent was dense. 30 pages of her father's personal notebooks, photographed and sent as a secure file, written in the same small, compressed handwriting as the blueprints. Arthur Sterling, Mason learned from those pages, had not been a tidy thinker. He'd been the kind of engineer who worked through problems by writing everything down, including the dead ends and the arguments with himself and the occasional profanity when something didn't work the way it was supposed to. Reading the notebooks was like sitting next to someone while they thought out loud, which was either irritating or illuminating depending on what you were looking for. Mason found it illuminating. The core unit was not an engine in any conventional sense. Arthur Sterling had spent 11 years working on what he called, in his notebooks, a resonant energy transfer system, a mechanism that operated on principles that Mason was not entirely equipped to evaluate on their engineering merits, but could understand on their mechanical reality, which was the part that mattered for what he needed to do. The system harvested kinetic energy not from combustion, but from the interaction of 2 counter-rotating magnetic assemblies whose frequency relationship could be tuned through a control mechanism that was, and this was the part that had defeated 300 engineers, disguised as an ordinary idle speed adjustment screw on the exterior of the unit. The car stalled under load because the control mechanism had been set, deliberately, to a frequency that created destructive resonance the moment torque demand exceeded idle. It was elegant and simple and almost invisible, and it had taken Mason 9 days of reading the notebooks and 3 days of examination with a frequency analyzer he'd borrowed from a friend who did acoustic work to understand what he was looking at. He was looking at sabotage. Not crude sabotage, not cut wires or sugar in a fuel tank. Sabotage that required knowing the system intimately enough to disable it from the inside, in a way that looked like a fault rather than interference, in a way that would have the car running perfectly until the moment someone needed it to actually perform. Someone had gotten to the car before Arthur Sterling could use it. Mason sat on his creeper in the middle of the garage floor on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the convoy had pulled into his lot, and held this understanding in his head for a while. Lily was at Carol's. Garrett was outside. The shop lights hummed above the prototype, which sat with its hood open and its secrets in various states of exposure across his workbench. He called Evelyn. "The car was sabotaged," he said, when she picked up. Not broken, not malfunctioning. Someone who understood the resonance system tuned the control mechanism to create a failure condition. A silence on her end that had weight to it. Someone with access to the car, Mason continued, before it went into storage. Or, Evelyn said slowly, before my father died. Yeah. Another silence. Can you fix it? I can restore the original tuning. It's a control adjustment, but it's not simple. The mechanism is calibrated in units that aren't standard. I need to work from your father's original specifications for the resonance frequency. He paused. Which means I need the actual blueprints back, not photographs. The photos don't have the precision I need for the calibration values. I can have them here tomorrow. Okay? He paused. Evelyn, whoever did this understood the system. That's a very short list of people. I know. Her voice had gone somewhere flat and careful. I've been thinking about that list since you called me 2 weeks ago. I have some ideas about it. She paused. I'd rather not say them out loud on a phone. That's fair. She came the next morning with the blueprints in a document tube and 2 coffees from the gas station on Route 9 because there was no coffee shop in Harlan Falls, and she stood at his bench while he opened the tube and laid out the sheets with the reverence and practicality that old documents with precise calibration values required. She'd been coming to the garage most mornings by then, not intruding, not managing, just present in the way that someone becomes present in a place when they have a reason to be there and nowhere better to be. She'd started bringing 2 coffees about a week in without comment, and Mason had accepted them without comment, and that was how that particular habit established itself. She stood at the bench and watched him work through the frequency values on the 3rd blueprint, and she said, "There were 4 engineers who worked directly with my father on the core system. 3 of them left the project before the prototype was finished, which my father attributed to funding pressures. He was paying them out of his personal accounts by then, and he couldn't maintain the salaries. 1 stayed until the end." Mason looked up. "His name was Dennis Farrow," she said. "He was my father's closest collaborator for 7 years. After my father died, he went to work for Vantech Industrial." She said the name of the company the way you say the name of something you've been holding carefully for a long time. He's been their chief technology officer for 19 years. Mason set down the blueprint. "Did you know this before?" "I knew he'd gone to Vantech. I didn't know, until the attorney in Columbus looked at the patent filing dates, that he was the listed co-inventor on 3 of their foundational patents." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "The filing date on the first patent is 4 months after my father's funeral." The garage was quiet. Outside, a car went down Meridian at normal speed. 4 months, Mason said. He would have needed the design documents, she said. The blueprints, the notebooks, all the materials that were in my father's office, which I was too young and too wrecked to inventory properly before the company was reorganized. She paused. I was 22. I thought the most important thing was to keep the company running. I trusted the people who said they were helping me. She stopped. I'm not looking for sympathy. I'm just explaining how it happened. I'm not offering sympathy, Mason said. I'm listening. She looked at him. That's almost the same thing from some people. I know. He picked up the blueprint again. But right now I'm mostly thinking about the calibration values. Something crossed her face that might have been the first genuine smile he'd seen from her, small and a little tired around the edges. Right, she said. He worked through the morning with the blueprints spread across the bench and Evelyn sitting in the chair he'd set up for her. Not Lily's stool, which Lily had opinions about, but an actual chair he'd brought from the house, reading through the notebook photographs on her tablet. They didn't talk much. Mason worked and Evelyn read, and the shop radio ran its country station at low volume. And it was strangely ordinary for a situation that was not ordinary at all. At 11:15, Garrett knocked on the side door with 2 knocks and a pause, which was the pattern that meant something worth noting without something worth panicking about. Mason opened the door. "Vehicle been on the street 3 times this morning," Garrett said. "Blue Accord, rental plates out of Columbus. Driver doesn't get out." He said it the way he said everything, even like he was reading weather conditions. "Third pass was slow." Mason looked at the street. Nothing there now. "Noted." Garrett went back to his position. Mason closed the door and looked at Evelyn, who had heard. "It's starting," she said. "It was already started. This is just the next part of it." She set her tablet down. "The exhibition," she said. "The Midwest Automotive Innovation Summit. It's in Cincinnati, 8 weeks from now. It's the largest automotive press event in the region. Media from 40 countries, industry executives, patent authorities." She paused. "If the car runs there, in front of all of those people, the proof of prior invention is public record before anyone can suppress it." Mason looked at her. 8 weeks. "I know 8 weeks is actually workable," he said. "If I understand the calibration correctly, the restoration is a precision job but not a lengthy one. The bodywork is cosmetic, most of it. The electrical management array needs a full diagnostic." He paused, calculating. "I need 2 weeks for the calibration and drivetrain testing, 2 weeks for the electrical system. That leaves 4 weeks for final assembly and static testing." "That's a tight margin." "I've worked tighter," he paused, "for less reason." Evelyn looked at the prototype. At the open hood, at the core unit sitting in the engine bay, surrounded by the careful evidence of a week's worth of Mason's work. "My father never got to hear it run," she said. "Not the completed version. The sabotage happened, we think, about 2 weeks before he planned to do his first full demonstration." She paused. "He died 6 weeks after that. The doctor said it was a heart condition he hadn't known about. I believed that for 12 years. Mason set down the tool he was holding. "And now?" She was quiet for a moment. "Now I know that a man under enough pressure, who knew something had been taken from him, who knew he couldn't prove it, who was watching his life's work disappear and couldn't stop it, could develop a heart condition very quickly." She paused. "I'm not making an accusation I can't support. I'm saying I've stopped believing it was only coincidence." Mason didn't say anything. He understood something about what she'd just described. Not the specifics, but the architecture of it, carrying a loss that had a shape you couldn't prove to anyone else. He'd lived in that architecture for some years himself, in a different context. He knew the weight of it. "Then we better make it run," he said. The threats escalated the second week of November, about 5 weeks before the exhibition. The first was another note, this time inside the garage. Not on a car, not under a wiper, but sitting on Mason's workbench when he came in on a Monday morning, which meant someone had been inside the locked building over the weekend while he and Lily were at a school function in Millfield. Garrett was furious in his quiet, contained way, and spent 2 hours examining every point of entry before concluding, with the compression of a man who does not like being bested, that someone had come through the roof access he hadn't considered because it was a manual hatch with a bolt-style latch that could be manipulated from outside with the right tool. The note said, "Last warning, we'll make it worth your while. Name your number." Mason photographed it and added it to the folder he'd started keeping in the locked filing cabinet under his bench. He didn't name a number. He had Garrett secure the roof hatch. The second escalation was a visit. 2 men came into the garage on a Wednesday afternoon, walking in through the open roll-up while Mason was under the car on the creeper, and announced themselves by the sound of their footsteps, which were too deliberate for customers. Mason rolled out from under the prototype and stood up and looked at them. They were wearing the particular kind of business casual that was designed to look non-threatening while also conveying the opposite. and one of them was holding a business card that he extended toward Mason with the confidence of someone who expected the gesture to do some of the conversational work for him. "Mr. Calloway," the man with the card said, "my name is Reeves. We represent a group of investors who have an interest in the vehicle you're currently working on." He had a Midwestern accent with the particular smoothed edges of someone who'd been to business school in the South. "We'd like to offer you an opportunity." Mason wiped his hands on a shop rag and took the card. He looked at it. No company name, just a phone number and the name Bradley Reeves. "Opportunity," he said. "We're authorized to offer $2 million for the vehicle and all associated materials you may have recovered. No questions, no complications. The transaction would be handled through a third-party attorney to protect your privacy." Mason set the card on the bench. "No." Reeves looked at him with the patience of a man who'd expected that answer. "Mr. Calloway, I'd encourage you to think about your situation carefully. You're a single father running a small operation in a—" He paused, and Mason could see him selecting a word that was diplomatic without being honest. "A competitive market. $2 million would—" I heard what $2 million would do," Mason said. "The answer is no. The people I represent are prepared to be flexible on the number." "It's not about the number." Reeves looked at him steadily. "What is it about?" Mason picked up the tool he'd set down when he rolled out from under the car. A torque wrench, not threatening, just something to hold. "There are blueprints that prove the technology in this car was invented before the patents your clients are currently holding were filed," he said, keeping his voice even and specific. "That's what it's about. I'd suggest your clients talk to their attorneys before they send more people to my garage." Something shifted in Reeves's face. Not much, but enough. He hadn't expected Mason to lay it out that plainly. "I think you're in deeper than you understand," he said, and the diplomatic register was mostly gone now. "That might be true," Mason said, "but I'm still in it. You can go now." They went. Not fast, not slow, with the measured exit of men who wanted to signal that leaving was their choice. Garrett was outside, which Mason knew because Garrett was always outside when something like this was happening, and Mason heard the footsteps cross the lot and the sound of car doors and an engine, and then Garrett appeared in the roll-up. "Got the plate," Garrett said. "Send it to Evelyn." "Already did." Mason went back under the car. He was not, if he was honest, as unshaken as he'd sounded in the conversation. His hands were steady. They were always steady. That was one thing his previous life had given him that he hadn't given back. But there was a particular alertness running in him that he recognized as the specific version of alertness that involved his daughter. He called Carol Briggs from under the car, which was awkward but necessary, and asked her to pick Lily up from school that afternoon and keep her for dinner. "Everything okay?" Carol said. "Just running behind on a job," he said, which was technically true. Lily called at 4:30 from Carol's phone. "Carol says you're busy, but she also made the face she makes when she knows something and isn't saying it," Lily reported. "Are you actually busy or is something happening?" "I'm actually busy." A pause. "Okay," she said in a tone that filed the answer provisionally. "Carol's making chicken. Can I stay?" "Yeah, I'll get you at 7. He got her at 7:15 because the last calibration sequence on the frequency adjustment ran longer than he'd expected, and she was waiting on Carol's porch in her coat, and she climbed into the truck and looked at him for a moment before looking forward at the street. "You look tired," she said. "I'm okay." "You look like you looked when you had to testify at that thing," she said, meaning the deposition for a car accident case 2 years ago where a client had tried to claim Mason had done the brake job wrong, and Mason had spent 3 weeks fighting it. "Like you're thinking about a lot of things at the same time." "I'm thinking about a job," he said, which was true. "The fancy car." "Yeah." She was quiet for a block. "Is it going to be okay?" Mason looked at his daughter in the passenger seat, 8 years old in her school coat with her backpack on her lap, watching him with the steady attention she'd been watching him with since she was old enough to watch anything. And he thought about the note on his workbench and the 2 men in the garage and the $60 billion corporate machinery that was now pointed at a one-bay shop in central Ohio. "Yeah," he said. "It's going to be okay." She looked at him for a moment longer, the way she always did when she was deciding whether to believe him, and then she looked back at the road. "Okay?" she said. He drove home in the dark, and behind them, the garage held its secrets in the October cold, and the car waited with the particular patience of something that had been waiting for 20 years and had learned not to be in a hurry. The offer came on a Thursday afternoon, delivered not by men in business casual, but by a letter through an attorney's office in Columbus, formal, legal, watermarked, the kind of document that was designed to feel like the end of a conversation. $30 million for Mason's professional services rendered and discretionary assistance with proprietary material transfer. The language was careful and bloodless and was structured, as Mason's own attorney, a general practice lawyer in Millfield who mostly did estate work but was smart enough to understand what she was reading, confirmed to implicate Mason in whatever they were claiming the car represented if he accepted. "They're trying to make you a party to the transaction," she said, on the phone, with the tone of someone who'd found something in a document she hadn't expected. "If you sign this, you're essentially acknowledging that the vehicle and its contents constitute proprietary material belonging to their clients, which would make the blueprints their property, which would make your having them a liability rather than evidence." A pause. "Don't sign this." "I wasn't going to sign this." "Good." Another pause. "Mason, how much trouble are you in?" He thought about that honestly. "Enough," he said, "but I think we're ahead of it." He told Evelyn about the letter that evening. She read it at his kitchen table. She'd started coming to the house sometimes, not often, when the garage conversation went long, and her expression did the thing it sometimes did now, less controlled than it had been when she'd first stepped out of the SUV in his lot, more willing to let whatever she was thinking sit on her face for a moment. "They're scared," she said. "That makes two of us." She looked up at him. "Are you scared?" He thought about it. "I'm careful," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at him for a moment. "My father used to say that." She paused. "He used to say that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was just being careful anyway, doing the work anyway." She set the letter down. "I used to think that was a way of avoiding the question. And now?" She looked at the table. "Now I think he was just being honest about what it actually felt like." The registration for the Midwest Automotive Innovation Summit required a vehicle description and a brief technical summary. Evelyn handled the registration under Sterling Motors, which was legitimate because the car was legally Sterling Motors property and the description was accurate, a prototype vehicle developed between 1998 and 2001 featuring a proprietary energy conversion system. No mention of the blueprints, no mention of the patents, no mention of Denny Faro or Vantec Industrial or the $30 million letter. The response came within 48 hours. The exhibition organizers were delighted to include the Sterling Motors prototype. They asked if Ms. Sterling would be available for a press briefing prior to the demonstration. She told them she would have someone available to speak to the technical specifications. She told Mason about this in the garage, where he was finishing the third week of calibration work, and he looked at her over the top of the open hood and said, "I'm not doing a press briefing. The car needs someone to explain what it does." "You can explain what it does?" "The more credible the source, the better. You're the CEO of an automotive company. You're the person who found what 300 engineers missed," she said. "That's the story." Mason looked at her for a moment. "I fix cars," he said. "You restored a prototype that contains the proof of the largest intellectual property theft in the automotive industry's history," she said, with the particular patience of someone who has made an argument before and expects to have to make it again. "You found the hidden compartment. You diagnosed the sabotage. You rebuilt the calibration system from 20-year-old handwritten blueprints." She paused. "That's not just fixing a car." "From where I'm standing, it is." She put her hands on the front of the car, on either side of the open hood. "Mason, will you just think about it?" "I'll think about it." He thought about it for 2 days and then told her he'd be there, but he wasn't speaking to press, which she accepted as the compromise it was. The calibration finalized cleanly in the 4th week, which was unexpected because calibration jobs rarely finalize cleanly, and Mason spent 2 days checking his own work because a result that came in clean on a complex system was as likely to mean you'd made an error in measurement as it was to mean you'd done it right. On the 3rd check, the readings were the same. The resonance frequency was aligned with Arthur Sterling's original specification to within the tolerances the blueprints allowed. He told Evelyn on a Friday evening. She was in the chair reading, and he came out from behind the car and leaned against the bench and said, "Calibration's done." She looked up. "Verified?" "3 times. She set the tablet down. She looked at the car. "What's next?" "Electrical diagnostic. Then I need to run the engine under controlled conditions before I close up the hood. I want to know it actually does what the numbers say it does." "And if it does?" "Then we figure out how to get it to Cincinnati." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the prototype. At the shape of it in the shop lights, low and continuous and made from something that was not standard automotive material, built by a man who'd understood that what he was building was too important to leave unprotected and not important enough, in the end, to actually be protected. "He would have liked you," she said, not looking away from the car. Mason didn't have a ready answer for that. "He didn't trust people easily," she said, "but he trusted people who did things because the things mattered, not because of what the things would get them." She paused. "You turned down $1 million because the situation didn't feel right to you. You turned down $2 million and then $30 million. You're doing this because—" She stopped. "Why are you doing this exactly?" Mason considered the question honestly. He looked at the car. "Because somebody hid those blueprints in there for 20 years, hoping the right person would eventually find them," he said. "And I found them. So," he paused, "seems like something you finish." Evelyn looked at him then. There was something in her face that he'd seen in pieces over the past weeks. The composure and the calculation and the grief underneath both. But right now it was all present at once, and she didn't seem to be managing it, which was different. "Okay," she said. Just that. Outside, November was doing what November did in Ohio, which was getting serious about being cold, and the street was quiet, and Garrett was in the truck, and somewhere across town, Lily was at Carol's watching the cartoons she thought were worth watching, and the garage held the smell of metal and motor oil and old blueprints, and the car that had been waiting 20 years sat under the shop lights and waited a little longer. Mason picked up his tools and went back to work. The electrical diagnostic took 11 days. Not because the system was damaged, it wasn't, not in any way that suggested deliberate interference, but because Arthur Sterling had built the management array using a proprietary logic architecture that didn't correspond to any diagnostic protocol Mason had worked with before. And working through an unfamiliar system without a current schematic required the particular combination of patience and systematic thinking that Mason had in reasonable supply, but not in infinite supply. He made 3 wrong assumptions in the first week, identified them, backed up, started again. This was normal. This was how actual diagnostic work went, as opposed to how people imagined it went. Evelyn came to the garage each morning and did her Sterling Motors work on her laptop at the bench while Mason worked. She'd reorganized her schedule sometime in the 3rd week. Mason hadn't asked about this, but he'd noticed that her phone calls had changed character. Fewer of them, more focused, like she'd handed a layer of daily operations to someone else and cleared her own time for this specific thing. She managed most of her communication in a focused hour in the morning and then put the phone away, which was not what Mason would have expected from someone running a company, but which, on reflection, he recognized as the behavior of someone who had decided what mattered right now. On the 9th day of the electrical diagnostic, she looked up from her laptop and said, "Denise Farrow retired from Vantech 18 months ago." Mason was tracing a circuit path along the management array with a probe. He didn't look up. "Where is he?" "Arizona, Scottsdale. He has a house there." She paused. The attorney in Columbus found something interesting. About 6 months before he retired, he filed a personal statement with a notary in Columbus. It's sealed, but the existence of it is public record. She found it in a search of notary filings. Mason set the probe down. He wrote something down. Something he wanted on record, officially witnessed. She closed the laptop. People do that when they want protection, or when they want to unburden themselves without fully committing to it. Or both. Or both. She looked at the car. He's 81 years old. Mason thought about an 81-year-old man in Scottsdale with a sealed statement at a notary in Columbus, Ohio, and about what that meant in terms of a conscience that had been carrying something for 19 years. Have you contacted him? Not yet. I didn't want to move on it without. She stopped, started again. Without knowing if we were going to be able to run the car. If the car doesn't run, the statement is just a statement. With the car, it's corroboration. The car's going to run, Mason said. She looked at him. You're sure? I'm not sure of anything until I'm sure, he said, which was honest. But the electrical architecture is clean. Your father built this thing right. Someone sabotaged the calibration system, but they didn't touch the electrical array, either because they didn't understand it well enough or because they ran out of time. He picked up the probe again. 2 more days on the diagnostic. Then I can run a static test. Evelyn nodded. She opened her laptop again and then closed it again. He knew he was building something that would change things, she said. My father. He talked about it like it was a responsibility, not an achievement. He used to say that a technology that could make energy cheap and clean wasn't a product, it was… She paused. He said it was something you owed people, that if you could build it, you had an obligation to finish it and get it into the world. She paused again. He didn't finish it. He finished it, Mason said. He just didn't get to show anyone. A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, the kind that has content to it. 2 more days, she said. 2 more days. The static test happened on a Saturday morning, which was not planned, but was when the diagnostic finished and Mason had gone through his verification checklist twice and found nothing he hadn't already addressed. Lily was at Carol's for a weekend visit because Carol's grandchildren were in from Dayton, and Garrett was outside in a position that Mason now understood covered 3 street approaches simultaneously, and Evelyn arrived at 7 in the morning with gas station coffee before Mason had called her, which meant she'd been up and ready to come. How did you know? He said, when she knocked on the side door. You sent me your checklist last night, she said. You'd checked off everything except final verification, and you had that look in the photos you sent of the engine bay. I didn't send photos last night. You sent 3, around 11 p.m. I think you didn't notice you'd done it. Mason looked at her for a moment and then stepped back to let her in. He took the coffee. The garage smelled the way it smelled when significant work had been done in it. Motor oil and metal, and the particular electrical smell of systems that had been run through diagnostics, and underneath it all, faintly, the older smell of the car itself, something he couldn't identify chemically, just the accumulated material identity of a machine that had been built with obsessive care and then locked away for 2 decades. He'd moved the car to the center of the floor and connected the management array to his monitor through a cable he'd fabricated because the standard connector didn't fit. The monitor was a second-hand diagnostic unit he'd modified for the purpose over the previous 2 weeks. Evelyn looked at the setup without comment because she'd watched it develop 1 day at a time and had run out of things to observe about it. If it starts, Mason said, I want you to stay back from the car until I've verified the resonance frequency is stable. I don't know what the harmonic output looks like under initial load, and I'd rather not have anyone standing too close to an unknown system. Okay. I'm serious. I heard you. She stood back against the workbench. I'm back. Mason got in the car. The interior was simple, 2 seats, minimal dashboard, instrumentation that was mostly analog with a single digital display for the system management readout. The seat was uncomfortable in the particular way of prototype seating, built for function rather than any consideration of the human body's preferences. He adjusted the seat, checked the system management display, checked the management array readout on his external monitor through the open driver's window, and then sat with his hand on the start control for a moment. He thought about Arthur Sterling, about the notebooks, about 11 years of work and the small compressed handwriting that ran across page after page of dead ends and recalculations, and occasional profanity, and the occasional passage that was less about engineering than about what the engineering was for. He thought about a man who had understood that what he'd built was important enough to hide rather than let it be taken, and had hidden it in the most personal thing he owned, and had trusted that someone would eventually find it and understand what it was saying. He turned the key. The system came up quietly, not the combustion noise of a conventional engine, a frequency that was more felt than heard, a resonance that moved through the seat and the floor and the steering column, a presence rather than a sound. The management display activated. The readouts on his external monitor began populating with values. He looked at the resonance frequency readout. It matched Arthur Sterling's original specification exactly. "It's up," he said, through the open window. Evelyn said nothing. He glanced in the mirror and she was standing with both hands wrapped around her coffee cup, not moving. He ran the system through its idle protocol for 3 minutes, watching the readouts, watching for variance or instability, watching for any sign that the calibration was drifting under thermal load. Nothing drifted. The frequency held with a steadiness that was, honestly, better than anything he would have predicted from a system that hadn't run in 20 years. Then he applied load. He did it gradually, in increments, with his eyes on the frequency readout, prepared for the destructive resonance to appear, prepared to cut power immediately if the values started moving toward the failure range. They didn't move toward the failure range. They held. He applied more load. Held. More. Held. He ran the system at full load for 90 seconds, watching the readouts, and then he cut power and sat in the silent car with his hands on the wheel, and the particular stillness that came over him when something had worked exactly the way it was supposed to work, which was rare enough that he didn't take it lightly. He got out of the car. Evelyn was standing exactly where she'd been standing. He didn't say anything immediately because he was looking at the external monitor, scrolling through the log data from the run, checking the values against the specifications on the blueprint he'd taped to the bench beside the monitor. "Mason," she said. "1 second. He checked the last value, looked at the blueprint, looked back at the monitor. "It ran clean," he said. "Full load, 90 seconds, no variance beyond thermal tolerance." He paused. "Your father got the numbers right." Evelyn set her coffee cup down on the bench. She set it down carefully, like she was giving herself something precise to do with her hands, and then she stood with her arms at her sides and looked at the car in the center of the garage floor, and her face did something that Mason looked away from, not because it was uncomfortable to see, but because it seemed like something that belonged to her. He went to the bench and started logging the test data. Behind him, the garage was quiet for a while. "Okay," she said eventually, in a voice that was mostly steady. "Okay. 3 weeks to Cincinnati," he said. "I need to do final body work, close up the compartment properly, do 2 more load tests at different durations, and fabricate a transport cradle that won't stress the calibration system in transit. What do you need?" "Time and quiet." He paused. "And someone to figure out how to get a prototype vehicle into an exhibition hall without anyone knowing it's running until it runs." She was already picking up her phone. "That part I can handle." The lawsuits arrived the following week, which was both expected and not expected in its specific form. There were 3 of them, filed simultaneously by 3 different law firms representing Vantech Industrial, Crown Energy Systems, and the Merid Group, respectively. The first claimed that the prototype vehicle was the property of an entity called the Sterling Technical Holdings Trust, a corporation Mason had never heard of. The second claimed that any technology contained in the vehicle constituted proprietary information belonging to Crown Energy Systems under a research and development agreement allegedly signed by Arthur Sterling in 2000. The third was a temporary restraining order application seeking to prevent the vehicle from being operated, transported, or displayed publicly pending a hearing. Mason's attorney in Millfield called him at 7 a.m. to read the filings to him. She had the careful, controlled tone of someone who had found something worse than she expected and was deciding how to present it. "The TRO application is the most immediate problem," she said. "If a judge grants it, you can't take the car to Cincinnati." "Can they get it granted?" "In a week? It's possible. These firms have resources." A pause. "But the application is weak on the merits. They're claiming imminent harm without specifying what the harm is, which is a problem for them. And the research agreement they're citing, I've looked at the language they quoted in the filing, and either the full document says something very different from the excerpts, or it's fabricated." "Is it fabricated?" A pause that was longer than it needed to be. "I think it's likely that it is," she said carefully, "which is an extraordinary thing to say. But the dates don't work, and the signatory format is inconsistent with Arthur Sterling's documented signature style on other contracts from the same period." She paused again. "I've seen document fraud twice in my career. This is what it looks like." "Can you prove it?" "Not quickly, but I know someone who might be able to." She gave him a name, a forensic document examiner at a university in Columbus who consulted on legal cases. She can turn an analysis in 4 days if I call in a favor. Call it in, Mason said. He called Evelyn after he hung up. She already knew about the lawsuits. Her corporate counsel had called her at 6. She was on her way to meet with them now, she said, and her voice had the compressed quality it got when she was managing multiple things simultaneously and had decided which one came first. The TRO is their real play, she said. Everything else is noise designed to make us spend money and attention. My attorney thinks the research agreement is fabricated. A brief silence. So do mine, she paused. I have to tell you something about Denise Farrow. Mason waited. I called him, she said, 2 days ago. I know I said I'd wait, but after the electrical test, I needed to know what he would do if this went public, whether he would contest or corroborate. She paused. He picked up on the second ring, like he'd been expecting the call. What did he say? The pause was the longest yet. He cried, she said quietly. He said he'd been waiting 19 years for someone to call him. He said... She stopped, started again. He said he was in the room when they sabotaged the calibration. He said he didn't do it himself, but he was there, and he didn't stop it, and he's been living with that. Her voice was very even, which Mason understood now meant she was working to keep it that way. He has documentation, physical documents, separate from the notary statement, design communications, internal memos from Vantech from 2001, correspondence that traces the theft explicitly. He kept them. He kept everything. He said he needed to know that someday... She stopped. He said he needed to know there was a record. Mason sat with this for a moment. He was in the kitchen, standing by the counter, and the morning light was coming through the window at its November angle, flat and gray and honest. He'll testify, Mason said. He said he would. He said he's 81 years old and he's not dying with it on him. She paused. His words. Mason thought about an old man in Scottsdale holding on to a folder of documents for 19 years, waiting for a phone call. He thought about the weight of that and about the particular human capacity for carrying things that should have been put down a long time ago. Okay, he said. When the TRO application goes to hearing, his documentation needs to be in front of the judge. Already working on it. The TRO hearing was 4 days later in a federal district courtroom in Columbus, and Mason drove up with his Millfield attorney, who had gotten the forensic document analysis in 3 days rather than 4, because she had, apparently, a more compelling way of calling in a favor than she'd initially indicated. The analysis was 42 pages, and concluded with the specific careful language of expert forensic testimony that the research agreement document submitted by Crown Energy Systems attorneys showed characteristics consistent with post-production alteration of key dates and signatory elements. The judge was a woman in her 60s with the manner of someone who had heard a great deal of legal argument in her career and had developed a precise tolerance for the genuine versus the performative. She read the forensic report at the bench. She looked at the Crown Energy attorneys. She asked 2 specific questions about the chain of custody of the alleged agreement, received answers that Mason's attorney later described as not helpful to their position, and denied the TRO application. Outside the courtroom, in the marble corridor, one of Crown Energy's attorneys stopped Mason and said very quietly, "You should understand that this isn't over." "I know," Mason said. "I'm going to Cincinnati anyway." The attorney looked at him for a moment and then walked away. The next 3 weeks were the most concentrated work Mason had done since the period in his life before Lily, when he'd had nothing but time and had poured all of it into the only thing that was working. He finished the body work. Not a full restoration in the cosmetic sense, because there wasn't time for that, and because it wasn't the point, but a thorough and honest preparation that brought every surface to a condition that was clean and correct and true to what it had been. He ran 2 more load tests at 3 minutes and then at 7 minutes, and both held clean. He fabricated the transport cradle himself, from steel stock he ordered from a supplier in Millfield, because the car's weight distribution was unusual enough that a standard cradle would have stressed the chassis in ways he didn't want, and because he was constitutionally unable to trust a fabricator he hadn't worked with before on something this specific. Evelyn came every morning. She was in communication with Denise Farrow in Scottsdale regularly now, daily, sometimes twice daily. and she reported on those calls in the evenings, in the garage or at his kitchen table, with the precise economy of someone relaying information they needed to share, but were still in the process of processing personally. Farrow was sending his documentation to the attorney in Columbus. Farrow had agreed to provide a sworn statement. Farrow had, apparently, also agreed to attend the exhibition in Cincinnati if his health permitted, because he wanted to see the car run. Evelyn told Mason this on a Tuesday evening at the kitchen table after Lily had gone to bed. She said it without particular inflection, but she was looking at the table when she said it, and Mason understood that the idea of the old man in Scottsdale coming to see the car that he'd watched fail 19 years ago finally run. That this meant something specific to her that didn't have a ready description. "He was my father's friend," she said, after a moment. "Before he was anything else. They met in graduate school. 30 years of friendship." She paused. "I don't know how you do that to someone you've known for 30 years. "I don't know either," Mason said. "Fear, probably. The kind that gets in before you've thought about it clearly, and then you've done the thing, and then you're living with it." She looked at him. "Does that make it understandable?" "Not the same thing as forgivable," he said. "But yeah, understandable." She was quiet for a moment. "My father would have forgiven him," she said. "I think. I don't know if I can." She paused. "I'm working on it." "That's enough," Mason said. She looked at him again, and there was something in the look that was more open than he'd seen from her, less arranged. She'd been in Harlan Falls for 6 weeks by then, in the rented house in Millfield, driving the gray sedan through a town she hadn't known existed before October, buying her gas station coffee, and talking to Garrett in the driveway sometimes in the mornings. She wasn't the same person who'd stepped out of the SUV in the pristine coat, or maybe she was exactly the same person, and just not performing the version of herself she'd performed then. "You know what I noticed?" she said. "What?" "The first time I came here, I had 4 security people with me. Now I have 1, and half the time I forget he's there." She paused. "This town did that." "Harlan Falls has a quality," Mason said. "Is that why you came back?" "After—" She stopped because she'd been careful about the before Lily topic, careful in a way that Mason appreciated, not pressing at things she hadn't been invited into. "After everything," he said, giving her the opening so she didn't have to manage around it. "Yeah, partly. It's also where I know how to be." He thought about how to say the next part. "I'm not good in a lot of places. I'm good here, in the shop, doing the work." He paused. "That's not nothing." "No," she said. "It's not." The transport to Cincinnati happened on a Thursday morning before dawn, which was Mason's idea. Fewer people on the highway, less visibility for anyone watching the shop. Garrett drove the truck pulling the transport cradle, Mason drove separately behind it, and Evelyn followed in the gray sedan. 3 vehicles on an Ohio highway at 5 a.m., ordinary enough that no one would look twice. The exhibition hall in Cincinnati was large and bright, and full of the specific organized chaos of a major event in its final setup days. Forklifts and electrical crews, and exhibition staff with clipboards, and the smell of fresh carpet and industrial cleaner, and the particular tension of large-scale things being made ready. Sterling Motors had a space near the center of the main floor, which Evelyn had arranged because a space near the center meant cameras from every direction, which was the point. They moved the car in through the service entrance at 6 a.m. and had it in the Sterling Motors space by 8, covered, before most of the other exhibitors had arrived. Mason checked every system once it was in position, running through his protocol in the new environment, accounting for the floor surface and the ambient temperature and the acoustic properties of the space, which would affect how the resonance frequency felt, if not how it measured. He was under the car checking the chassis when he heard Lily's voice. He came out from under the car and found her standing at the edge of the Sterling Motors space with Carol Briggs, looking at the covered prototype with the specific interest she showed for things that she'd heard about for weeks and was now seen for the first time in person. She'd begged to come, and he'd said no 3 times and then said yes because the argument she'd made, which was that she'd been patient about the whole thing for 2 months and deserved to see it, was accurate. "It's bigger than I thought," she said. "You've seen the photos." "Photos make things look smaller." She walked around it carefully, not touching, which she knew was the rule. "When does it run?" "Tomorrow morning." She looked at the covered shape. Are you nervous? Mason considered the honest answer. A little, he said. She looked at him with that steady attention. Don't be, she said. You fixed it. It'll work. The certainty in her voice, the complete, unqualified certainty of someone who had watched her father work for 8 years and had never once seen him leave a job unfinished, settled something in Mason's chest that had been slightly unsettled since they'd driven into Cincinnati. Okay, he said. Go stay with Carol. That evening, after the hall closed to exhibitors and Mason had done his last check, and the car was as ready as it was going to be, Evelyn found him sitting on the edge of the Sterling Motors platform with his back to the covered prototype and a cup of cold gas station coffee in his hand. She sat down beside him. The hall was quiet and dim in its after-hours state, the other exhibition spaces covered and dark, the ceiling lights at their overnight minimum. Dennis Farrow landed in Cincinnati this afternoon, she said. He'll be here tomorrow. Mason nodded. The attorney has submitted his documentation to the federal IP office as a preliminary filing, she said. The formal challenge can't go through until after the public demonstration establishes the proof of prior art, but the submission is on record. Mason nodded again. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, How are you doing? He thought about it. He thought about the past 8 weeks, the notes, the men in business casual, the $30 million letter, the lawsuit, the courthouse corridor. He thought about the calibration work and the frequency readouts, and the moment the engine had come up in his garage on a Saturday morning and the resonance had moved through the floor and the seat and his hands on the wheel. He thought about a man he'd never met who'd written in small, precise handwriting across 40 pages of engineering notebooks, trying to get something right and trying to keep it safe at the same time, and not fully managing either. I'm okay, he said. Evelyn looked at him. Mason? I'm genuinely okay, he said. The car's ready. That's all I've been thinking about for 8 weeks. Now it's ready. He paused. The rest of it is not my department. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something he didn't expect. Thank you, she said simply, without the weight that people sometimes put on those words to make them more impressive, just directly. For not taking the first offer. He looked at her. If I'd taken the first offer, you'd have found someone else. Maybe, she said, but they wouldn't have found the compartment. Someone would have. Not in 8 weeks. She looked at the covered car. Not in time. She paused. The timing matters. Farrow is 81. The corporate attorneys are already generating delay strategies. 6 more months and the window on this closes in ways that are very hard to reopen. She paused. You made it happen in time. Mason looked at the covered prototype in the dim hall. He thought about timing, about the 8-year-old kid in his garage on a stool doing homework, who would grow up watching her father do his work and might someday understand or might not, might just remember that he was always there, present and careful, which was its own kind of thing. He thought about what it meant to do the right thing in the right amount of time. He thought it mostly just meant showing up and paying attention and not stopping when it got difficult, which was simpler to describe than to do, but not more complicated than that. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Evelyn stood up from the platform edge. She looked at him for a moment, and then she put her hand briefly on his shoulder. Not a gesture of affection exactly, more the gesture of someone who has run out of words for what they mean and is using the available vocabulary. And then she walked toward the service exit. Mason sat in the quiet hall a while longer. The car behind him held its 20-year silence for one more night, patient and still, waiting for morning. Mason didn't sleep well in the hotel room. This wasn't unusual. He rarely slept well in unfamiliar beds, and the hotel in Cincinnati had the particular quality of business travel accommodations everywhere, anonymous and temperature-controlled and slightly too quiet in a way that his body couldn't fully trust. He lay awake for a while looking at the ceiling and thinking about the resonance frequency values from the last load test, running them against the specifications in his head the way you run a familiar route when you need to calm down. Not because you expect to find anything new, but because the familiarity itself is the point. At 5:15, he stopped pretending he was going to sleep more and got up and made the weak hotel coffee and sat at the small desk by the window looking at the Cincinnati skyline going from black to gray in the early morning. He thought about Lily in the hotel room 2 floors up, sleeping the deep and uncomplicated sleep of someone who had no particular stake in resonance frequency values and had been thrilled by the hotel's cable television selection. He thought about that for a while and found it grounding in the specific way that thinking about Lily was always grounding. It pulled the situation to its actual scale, reminded him what was real and what was just pressure. He was at the exhibition hall by 6:30. The hall didn't open to exhibitors until 7, but the service entrance knew him by now, and the overnight security staff had seen him often enough in the setup days that they waved him through without checking his badge. He went straight to the Sterling Motors space and pulled back the cover on the prototype and stood looking at it in the early hall light. It looked the same as it always looked. That was the thing about cars. They didn't register occasion. They didn't know that today was different from yesterday. The machine was what it was, indifferent to the weight that humans had loaded onto it, and there was something steadying about that indifference. He went through his pre-run checklist for the third time, not because he expected to find anything, because doing it a third time was the kind of thing that separated a mechanic who was confident from a mechanic who was right, and Mason had always preferred being right over feeling confident. He checked every connection in the management array. He verified the calibration values against the physical record he carried in his shirt pocket, a handwritten card with the specifications in Arthur Sterling's original units, transcribed from the third blueprint. He checked the tire pressure on all 4 corners because the transport cradle had changed the load distribution and he wanted the car sitting level. He checked the floor under the car for any sign of fluid. Everything was exactly as it should be. At 7:15, Evelyn arrived. She was wearing a dark suit that Mason hadn't seen before, which he noticed only because she'd been mostly in casual clothes for the past 8 weeks, and the suit made her look like the person she was described as in business magazines, rather than the person who brought gas station coffee to a garage in Harlan Falls, Ohio. Both were accurate. He understood that now. She looked at the uncovered car and then at him. "How is it?" "It's fine. How are you?" "I'm fine," said the way people say they're fine when they're managing the gap between what they feel and what's useful to feel right now. She stood beside him and looked at the car. "Denis is here. He's in the hall. I had him brought in through a different entrance. He's in a wheelchair, but he insisted on being on the floor." "Is he okay?" "He's 81 and he hasn't slept in 2 days," she said, "but he said he's been waiting 19 years and he's not waiting in a green room." The hall opened at 8. It filled with the steady tide of an industry event. Journalists with press credentials and camera equipment, corporate representatives who moved in small deliberate clusters, automotive engineers who were identifiable by the way they looked at vehicles, slowly and from close range. The Sterling Motors space drew attention partly because of the name, and partly because the car was covered, which was a choice Evelyn had made deliberately. Covered things at exhibitions created a specific kind of gravity. The Vantech industrial space was 3 rows over. Mason noticed it when he walked the floor at 8:30, stretching his legs, keeping his hands loose. Their display was elaborate, backlit panels and a mounted engine cross-section, and 2 vehicles on platforms. Several men in suits were clustered near the space, having the kind of conversation that involved phones and tight expressions. One of them looked across the floor and found Mason with his eyes, and Mason looked back at him without adjusting his pace or his expression, and then he turned the corner and went back to the Sterling Motors space. Evelyn was there with a woman Mason hadn't met, the patent attorney from Columbus, who turned out to be in her 60s, compact and brisk, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a messenger bag that appeared to contain approximately half her body weight in documents. Her name was Claire Ashworth, and she shook Mason's hand with the grip of someone who had been shaking hands in legal settings for 4 decades and had concluded that grip communicated something worth communicating. "You're the mechanic," she said. "Yes." "Good work on the TRO," she said, which Mason understood meant she'd read the hearing transcript. "The forensic analysis was well-timed. That was my attorney in Millfield." "I know. I spoke with her." She looked at the prototype. "I've been doing patent work for 31 years, she said, and I've never had a case where the primary evidence was hidden in a car. First time for everything," Mason said. She almost smiled. "The federal filing is positioned. The moment this car runs publicly, the prior art argument is activated. What we need today is witnesses and documentation." She looked around the hall. "We have both. What we need from you is the car." That's the part I can handle, Mason said. Carol arrived with Lily at 9 because Lily had a strong position on being present for things she'd been waiting for, and the position had been accepted. Lily appeared in the Sterling Motors space in her good jacket, the navy one she wore to school presentations, with her backpack because she didn't go anywhere without her backpack, and she looked at the covered car and then at all the people in the hall with the frank and open interest of someone for whom the scale of an event was interesting rather than intimidating. "It's loud," she said to Mason. "Exhibition halls are loud." "Is that the lady?" she said, meaning Evelyn, dropping her voice approximately 30%, which was the volume adjustment she made when she was trying to be less obvious about something. "You've met her," Mason said. "In the garage, twice." "She looks different. She's wearing a suit." Lily considered this. "She looks like someone important." "She is someone important." Lily looked at her father. "So are you," she said in the matter-of-fact tone she used for things she considered obvious, and then she went to find Carol. The demonstration was scheduled for 11 a.m. By 10:30, the Sterling Motors space had accumulated a crowd that extended into the adjacent aisles, drawn partly by the covered car and partly by the word that had been moving through the hall since 8 o'clock, the specific word that moves through any industry gathering when something is about to happen that people don't fully have the shape of yet. The press contingent had grown. Mason counted camera operators from at least a dozen outlets, and there were journalists he didn't recognize, positioned at the edges of the space with the particular stillness of people who've been told something is going to be worth watching. He found Dennis Farrow in a wheelchair at the edge of the Sterling Motors platform, positioned so he had a clear line of sight to the car. The old man was thin in the way of the very old, wearing a blazer that was slightly too large for him now, with hands that showed the particular architecture of a lifetime of engineering work, knuckles enlarged, fingers slightly curved at rest in the way of hands that had spent decades holding instruments. He was looking at the covered prototype with an expression that Mason couldn't fully read and didn't try to. Mason crouched down beside the wheelchair so they were at the same level. "Dennis Farrow," he said. The old man looked at him. His eyes were still sharp. "Mason Calloway." He paused. "You found the compartment?" "Yes." "I didn't know if anyone ever would," Farrow said. His voice was thin, but his diction was exact. He built it to be found by someone who understood the car, someone who would look at a variance in a body seam and ask why. He paused. Most people don't ask why. Most people aren't looking for it. Farrow looked at the covered car. "The frequency calibration. You restored it from the notebooks?" "From the third blueprint, section 4, the calibration values." Farrow nodded slowly. That was the page he was most careful about. He redrew that section 3 times. He wanted it precise enough that someone could reconstruct it from scratch. He paused. He knew. He knew what was going to happen, and he didn't have time to stop it, so he made sure someone could reconstruct it. He looked at Mason. "Did it run clean?" 3 load tests, all clean. The old man's eyes went briefly to something Mason couldn't see. His jaw worked for a moment. Then he said, "He would have been glad to know that," in a voice that was very steady, which Mason understood required effort. "Were you there when he built the calibration section?" "I was there for all of it," Farrow said. 11 years. He paused. "I was there at the end, too. I've told Evelyn what happened. I expect I'll be telling it to federal investigators before the year is out." He looked at Mason directly. "I'm not looking for absolution. I'm looking to set the record straight while I still can. That's different." "I know the difference," Mason said. Farrow looked at him for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I think you do." Mason straightened up. Evelyn had come to stand a few feet away, listening, and when Mason stood, she looked at the old man in the wheelchair, and then at Mason, and something moved between them that was too specific to name, but that both of them understood, the way you understand some things without having the language for them. At 10:50, Mason got into the car. The crowd around the Sterling Motors space had continued to grow, and the noise of the hall, conversations, machinery, the ambient sound of 1,000 people and their equipment, had taken on the particular changed quality that happens when a large group of people collectively decide to pay attention to one thing. It wasn't silence. It was focused attention, which is different. Mason ran through his final check. Management display. Resonance readout. He looked at the external monitor that his Millfield attorney had positioned at the edge of the platform where the data could be seen on screen in real time. Frequency values, load values, run duration, all of it live and visible to anyone who wanted to look at the numbers. Claire Ashworth had insisted on this. Real-time public data was harder to contest than reported data. He looked out the driver's window. Evelyn was at the front of the space, between the covered car and the crowd, standing with the composed attention of someone who has been waiting for something for a long time and has arrived at the moment and isn't entirely sure what to do with the arrival. Claire Ashworth was beside her with her phone up, recording. The attorney from Columbus had, apparently, not become a person who left things unrecorded in 31 years of patent work. Lily was at the edge of the platform with Carol. She caught her father's eye through the windshield and gave him a single nod, chin down and back up, with the seriousness of someone conferring official sanction. Mason almost smiled. He took hold of the start control. He thought briefly about Arthur Sterling, about a man who had spent 11 years building something he believed in and had hidden the proof of it in the most personal thing he owned, trusting the future to produce someone who would find it and finish it. Mason didn't think of himself as the person Arthur Sterling had been trusting. That was too large a frame, and he was too practical a person to wear it. He thought of himself as the mechanic who had looked at a body seam and asked why. That was all. Sometimes that was enough. He turned the key. The resonance came up through the floor of the car and the seat and the wheel in his hands, that frequency that was felt more than heard, present and steady and clean. The management display populated. The values on the external monitor began scrolling, live, visible to the hall. He heard the crowd shift, the particular audible change when a large group of people encounter something unexpected, something that doesn't fit their category system. The prototype sounded like nothing else in the hall. In a space full of combustion engines and electric motors and the recorded sounds of automotive performance, the resonant signature of Arthur Sterling's core system was immediately, unmistakably different. Not louder, not quieter, just other. Mason applied load. The frequency held. The values on the monitor tracked exactly along the specification line he'd drawn in red on the screen. The reference line taken directly from the blueprints, visible to every camera in the room. He applied more load. Held. More. Held. He ran the system at full load. 2 minutes. 3. The values stayed exactly where Arthur Sterling's calculations had predicted they would stay 25 years ago in a notebook filled with small, precise handwriting. The crowd was very quiet now, in the specific way that crowds go quiet when they have understood something, when the information has landed and they are still in the first moment of having received it. At 5 minutes, Mason cut the power. He sat in the sudden quiet with his hands on the wheel and listened to the hall. And then, from somewhere in the crowd, someone started clapping, and it spread outward in the way that applause spreads when it isn't performed but just happens. When people's hands come together because they have no other available response to what they've witnessed. Mason got out of the car. Evelyn was standing where she'd been standing, and her face was doing the thing it had done in the garage on the Saturday of the first test, that complicated and unmanaged thing, except this time there were 200 people around her and a dozen cameras, and she wasn't in control of it, and he could tell that she'd decided, for once, not to manage it. He walked to the edge of the platform. Claire Ashworth was already on the phone. The press contingent surged forward, and the Sterling Motors PR staff, who had been briefed on how to handle the post-demonstration media engagement, moved to create a workable perimeter. Mason stepped off the platform and let the PR staff manage the cameras that swung his direction and found Lily in the crowd. She pushed through to him with her elbows in the way she moved through crowded spaces, efficient and unapologetic, and she came up and stood in front of him, looking up. "I could feel it," she said. "Through the floor. The resonance, yeah. It felt like," she thought about it, "like something real." "It is something real," Mason said. She looked back at the car, at the crowd around the Sterling Motors space, at the cameras and the journalists and the corporate faces trying to figure out what had just happened to their afternoon. She looked at all of it with those calm 8-year-old eyes, and then she looked back at her father. Can we get lunch after? She said. Mason laughed. Actually laughed, a short and genuine one that surprised him. Yeah, he said. We can get lunch after. What happened in the weeks and months following the demonstration was complex and slow and involved more attorneys than Mason had previously met in his entire life. The Federal IP Office opened a formal investigation into the patent filings made by Vantec Industrial, Crown Energy Systems, and the Merid Group. Dennis Farrow provided a full sworn statement in Columbus and turned over his documentation, which amounted to 43 physical documents and a personal record he'd kept in a locked box in his study in Scottsdale for 19 years, covering everything from the original theft to the fabrication of the research agreement. The forensic document examiner who had identified the fake Crown Energy agreement was retained for the full investigation. The corporations responded the way corporations respond when the ground beneath them is moving, with lawyers and delay strategies, and in the case of Vantec's board, the abrupt departure of 3 senior executives, including Dennis Farrow's successor as Chief Technology Officer. The departure happened 12 days after the exhibition and was covered as an internal restructuring until it wasn't. The story broke 6 weeks after Cincinnati, in a trade publication that had obtained documents from the federal investigation through a source that was never identified. And from there, it moved into mainstream coverage with the speed that major corporate fraud stories move when the evidence is documented and the participants are making the kinds of decisions that people make when they're hoping to get ahead of something they can't stop. Mason followed the news the way he followed most things that weren't happening in his garage. At a distance, with attention when it was relevant, without allowing it to reorganize his life around it. He had a 1957 Bel Air waiting for him that he'd promised a retired teacher in October and had been forced to delay, and a carburetor rebuild on a '69 Camaro that was overdue, and the ordinary work of the shop, which had continued through everything because the shop was the thing that kept going regardless of what else was happening. Lily went back to school on the Monday after Cincinnati and reported that her friend Josie had seen something about a car show on her parents' TV and that Lily's father had been mentioned, which Lily found interesting, but not as interesting as the fact that their class was doing a science project on magnets, which she thought Mason might have useful input on. He had some input on magnets, as it happened. Garrett left 2 weeks after the exhibition, shook Mason's hand in the driveway, said the house was secure and the motion light on the north corner was pointing correctly now, and drove away in the dented Chevy pickup. Mason watched him go and thought that was probably the last he'd see of Garrett, and felt something like gratitude for the quiet competence of people who showed up and did what was needed and didn't make a production of it. The lawsuits against Mason collapsed over the following 3 months, one by one, in the particular way of legal actions that were always more strategy than substance. They became too expensive to maintain and too visible to continue when the underlying strategy they were designed to protect was already coming apart. His attorney in Millfield called each time one was dismissed, in a tone that got progressively less careful and more satisfied. After the 3rd dismissal, she said, "I think we're done." And Mason said, "Good." And they were. Evelyn called him from New York in January, 3 months after Cincinnati, to tell him the federal investigation had expanded to include criminal referrals for 2 executives at Vantec and 1 at Crown Energy. She said it the way she said important things, direct and without performance. But he could hear something in her voice that was lighter than her voice had been in October, a quality of pressure that had been released. "The IP restoration is going to take another year in the courts," she said. "Claire says maybe 2, but the precedent is established. The prior art is on the public record. Whatever the timeline, it ends the same way." "How's Denny?" Mason asked. A pause. "Tired," she said. "But, okay, he said he's sleeping better." Another pause. "I went to see him last month in Scottsdale." Mason waited. "It was—" She stopped, started again. "It was hard, and it was the right thing to do. Both of those were true at the same time." She paused. He cried again. "He keeps apologizing for things that happened 19 years ago, and I keep telling him the apology was the statement he filed with the notary, not the words. And he says he knows that, but he needs to say it anyway." She paused. "So I let him say it." "That's the right call," Mason said. "I know." A beat. "I'm setting up the foundation. The one for young engineers, it'll be called the Arthur Sterling Foundation. I know, it's not subtle, but it's accurate." She paused. I'd like you to be on the advisory board. Evelyn, not in a formal capacity. I'm not asking you to attend meetings in New York, just your name and your judgment when I need it, and the right to call you when something comes up that's more mechanical than anything my corporate board knows how to handle. Mason thought about it. That I can do, he said. Good. A pause, different from the professional pauses. Mason. Yeah. How are things in Harlan Falls? He looked through the garage window at the street. February in Ohio. Gray and honest, the snow from last week still sitting on the ground in the particular damp way of snow that hadn't been cold enough to stay clean. The Bel Air was on the lift. Lily's drawings were taped to the office wall, 3 new ones since December, and her stool was in its corner. The shop radio was running its country station at low volume. Pretty good, he said. The Bel Air's coming along. The retired teacher? Yeah, she's been patient. You take good care of people, Evelyn said, and the way she said it was not a compliment, just an observation, factual, and considered, the way she said things she'd thought about carefully. Mason didn't have a ready answer for that either, which was becoming a pattern with her. I'll be in Ohio in March, she said. I want to see how the foundation site selection is going, and I want to bring you something. You don't need to bring me anything. I know I don't need to. A brief pause. I want to. There's a difference. She came in March on a Tuesday, in the gray sedan, without Garrett or anyone else, and parked in the driveway and knocked on the garage side door the way she'd knocked on it since November. Mason opened it, and she came in and looked at the Bel Air on the lift and the general state of the shop with the easy familiarity of someone who had spent enough time in a place to see it rather than just look at it. She put a flat package on the bench, brown paper, taped carefully. Open it, she said. Mason opened it. It was one of Arthur Sterling's original blueprint pages. Not a photograph, not a reproduction. The original, in its aged cream yellow, with the small precise handwriting in the margins. The third page. The calibration section. He stood looking at it for a moment. Claire had it certified and authenticated as part of the federal record, Evelyn said. The case has full digital copies. This one, she paused. My father drew that in 1999 in a rented workshop in Pennsylvania trying to get the numbers right. He redrew it 3 times. This was the 3rd version. She paused. It belongs somewhere it'll be seen. Mason looked at the blueprint, at the calibration values he'd read 100 times, that he could recite from memory now. At the handwriting in the margins, Arthur Sterling's arguments with himself, his notes, his certainty and uncertainty interleaved in blue ink that had aged to the particular soft color of things preserved by care rather than luck. I don't have anywhere good to hang things, Mason said. The office wall, Evelyn said, between Lily's drawings. He looked at her. I've been in here enough times to know the office wall, she said. He carried it into the small office and looked at the wall. Lily's drawings, 3 of them, cars mostly, with the particular confident line of a kid who had grown up watching things being made and had decided she understood the shapes of them. He found a clear space and hung the blueprint between a yellow crayon car and a blue marker, 1, and stepped back and looked at it. It was the right place for it. He wasn't entirely sure why, but it was. She draws cars, Evelyn said from the doorway. She draws everything, but mostly cars. Smart kid, Evelyn said. She has her moments. He paused. She has a lot of moments. They stood in the doorway looking at the wall for a moment. The blueprint between the drawings, the calibration values that had taken 11 years to develop, and 20 years to hide, and 8 weeks to restore, sitting between 2 crayon cars drawn by an 8-year-old who didn't fully know what any of it meant, but who had watched her father do the work and absorbed, without being told, that the work mattered. The foundation site, Evelyn said, pulling back to the professional register but without the same wall behind it that had been there in October. I've been looking at a location in Columbus, but there's a property in Millfield that came up in the search, and I think it might be more interesting, better access, different kind of community. I'd like your opinion on it. I can drive out there, Mason said. When do you want to go? I'm free now, if you are. Mason looked at the Bel Air on the lift. He'd been planning to work on the electrical system this afternoon, which was a job that could wait until tomorrow without creating a problem. He thought about the retired teacher, who had been patient for 5 months and would be patient for one more day, and he thought about property in Millfield and a foundation that would carry Arthur Sterling's name and send young engineers out into a world that had not been particularly kind to the original engineer, but might learn something from what had happened to him. "Let me close up the lift," he said. He closed up the lift and locked the shop and wrote a note for Lily, in case she got back from Carol's before he did. "Out with Evelyn? Back by dinner? Pizza? Okay?" And left it on the kitchen table where she'd see it. He got into the gray sedan, which still had a gas station coffee in the cup holder from that morning, and Evelyn drove out of Harlan Falls toward Millfield, and the town went past the windows in its particular February light. The feed co-op, the library, the bracket above the garage door that still had no letters, and probably never would, because some things you stop planning to fix and start just accepting as part of the shape of where you live. He thought about what Lily had said in the exhibition hall, when the car had run and the floor had vibrated and she'd looked up at him with her serious 8-year-old eyes and said, "It feels like something real." That was the thing, Mason thought. That was the whole thing, distilled down to what an 8-year-old could see clearly and most adults spent their lives trying to locate. The work that feels like something real. The decision that holds up when you look at it straight. The choice to stay when staying is harder than going. To finish when finishing costs more than you expected. To refuse what's being offered because what's being offered isn't the right thing no matter how large the number attached to it. He hadn't done any of it because he was heroic. He'd done it because he couldn't not do it, because a car had a story to tell, and he was the person who'd been standing there when it started talking, and walking away from that had never seriously occurred to him as an option. He was a mechanic in a town with no sign above the garage door, and a daughter who knew when he'd put something in wrong, and a life that looked small from the outside and felt exactly the right size from where he was living it. The Millfield property, when they got there, was a converted industrial building on the north edge of town. Brick, substantial, with large windows on the east face and enough floor space for equipment and offices and the kind of open collaborative working areas that Evelyn described as she walked through with her phone out, photographing and noting. Mason walked the space separately, looking at the structural elements, the electrical panel, the floor that had been poured for industrial load. Good bones, he thought, solid. The kind of building that had been built to last and had lasted, which was not nothing. "What do you think?" Evelyn said, from across the floor. "It's a good building," he said. "Worth the work?" He looked at the ceiling, at the bones of the thing. "Worth the work," he said. She nodded and photographed another wall. They drove back toward Harlan Falls in the late afternoon, the February light going orange at the edges, the way winter light does when it's low and clean and there's nothing between you and the sky. Mason looked at the road and thought about nothing in particular, which was rare enough that he noticed it. That particular state of having done enough that your mind goes quiet, not empty but resting, the way you feel after a job that went right. "Mason," Evelyn said without taking her eyes off the road. "Yeah. I'm going to need someone to oversee the mechanical infrastructure at the foundation, the workshop side of it, someone who understands how things are actually built and doesn't just know the theory." She paused. "Not full-time. Consulting. On your schedule." "You're asking me." "I'm asking you." He looked at the road. Thought about it genuinely, not as a gesture. "The garage stays open," he said. "That's non-negotiable." "The garage stays open. That's not even a question. And I'm not moving to Columbus. Millfield is 20 minutes from your house." "I know where Millfield is." "So," she paused, "is that a yes?" He thought about the blueprint on the office wall between Lily's drawings. He thought about Arthur Sterling writing calibration values for the 3rd time in a rented workshop in Pennsylvania, trying to get the numbers right, trying to build something that would outlast the circumstances trying to stop it. He thought about what it meant to do work that mattered. It didn't always look important from the outside. It didn't always pay what it was worth. It didn't protect you from the people who were threatened by it, or the nights when you lay awake running numbers in your head to calm yourself down. It just meant that when you looked at what you'd done, it held up. The thing worked. The numbers were right. The person across the floor got what they'd been waiting for. That was enough. That had always been enough. Yeah, Mason said. That's a yes. Evelyn didn't say anything else, and Mason didn't either, and they drove the last few miles back to Harlan Falls in the kind of quiet that doesn't need to be filled, the kind that happens between people who have been through something together and come out the other side and found, to their mutual and slightly surprised satisfaction, that they trust each other. The shop was dark when they pulled in, and the street was quiet, and the bracket above the roll-up door was empty against the last of the February sky. And through the kitchen window, Mason could see the light on, which meant Lily was home, which meant the note had been found, which meant there was probably going to be a conversation about whether pizza included the kind with the thin crust or the regular kind, a conversation he had every time and always lost. He got out of the car and looked at the garage. At the building he'd been working in since before Lily was born, that smelled like motor oil and metal and 20 years of honest effort. At the missing sign that had stopped bothering him so long ago that he couldn't remember when. Some things were worth protecting, some things were worth finishing, some things were worth staying for, even when staying was hard, and the offers to leave were large, and the people making the offers had the resources to be very convincing. Mason Calloway had known this for a long time. He just needed the right car to remind him that other people knew it too, and had trusted someone to eventually show up and understand. He went inside.